Well, welcome to another Sunday afternoon class from the BYU Library Family History Center. Today, we're going to talk about getting out of the rut of your genealogical research. This is kind of an extreme example of a rut in this little image here, but this image is it's kind of a substitute for an old photograph I had that I had from my father in northern Arizona. When I grew up, there very, very few of the roads were paved. Most of the roads were dirt roads. The road out in front of our house was dirt, both sides of the house, and it was not unusual to have mud and have a problem. Well, there's a problem when you have mud, and that is the mud. When you drive over it, you make these big grooves in it, and then the next car comes along. It makes a bigger groove, and then when it dries out, those ruts are solid, almost solid rock, because this is all kind of a clay sandstone kind of muddy stuff. The picture I have is similar to this. It's one of these old trucks with this hay on the back. The difference was that my father was either along with the ride with the truck or driving that truck, and it was definitely stuck up to its axles in this mud. And the only thing they could do is unload the entire load of hay, one bale at a time. Somehow get something to pull the truck out. Usually, some kind of a horse team or something might come along, or they might be able to do something, or dig it out, which was the other option. And then reload the truck and see how far they could get going. In essence, what happened there was that you would have a saying. This is something that I heard from time to time about Arizona and about the roads. And the saying was, choose your rut, because you're going to be in it for a long time. And this was kind of the rule of going across these big valleys up in northern Arizona. And driving as I did many times on dirt roads, I had the same experience. I would often get into a rut, and it would be deep enough that there was no way you could get the car out until you got to a point where it was washed out, or somehow there was a way for you to turn and move over. Well, how this is relative to what we're doing in genealogy is we have lots of ruts. We get stuck in areas where we're uncomfortable moving. We're following the road, but we're not really making much of an effort to get out of it. And what I see is people who are capable and have good genealogical skills, but are focusing on things that are really ruts. They're really just holding them from actually understanding and becoming more proficient and absolutely more having a greater experience doing genealogical research. And the first rut is continually working on the same family line to the exclusion of your other lines. If you go back and if you had that kind of historical perspective, for example, of a huge family tree like the family search family tree, and you would realize that many of the people originally, when they did research directly on the surname line, and incidentally might add in the spouses and might put in some small amount of information about the spouse's parents and family. And so for many years now, it's been a great opportunity to do research on family search because of that very simple fact that people were in the rut of doing just their surname. And so in this case, for example, this Morgan line goes back, Morgan, actually goes way back and of course, does end way before all of the names end, but in this particular illustration, the names of the people you'll see. For example, this Morgan line going back and back, but you've got Gerard Morgan the second, or the second one in the middle there, with Sarah Sanderson, and they have her parents, but that's it. The Sanderson line and the Foscue lines do not go way back. And so there's just a lot more research that can be gained from being aware of the fact that you may think that that's a very laudable or good activity to exhaust everything you can on your surname line, but it's really helpful to the general community and your family as a greater family out there with all of your relatives to be aware of all the other lines that are available. And then this becomes even the kind of more focused area than even the being focused on just the family line, just your standard family name line. And the difficult, of course, with family name lines is that any line like the Tanners, for example, go back into Rhode Island in the colonial days, and there it ends. There is just no more information about who the parents are of the last person in that line. William Tanner is his name. And so it's just gone. If you want to spend any more time on it, you're going to be spending an awful lot of time on one individual, and that's what happens in a lot of cases, is that you're focusing on the end of line person and spent tremendous amount of effort and time on that person, but you've never found anything. There doesn't seem to be any records. It seems like the person vanished off the face of the earth, and I mean, appeared out of nowhere and didn't have anything to say where they came from. And that's the case, by the way. And if you know anything about the history of our country, the United States, and some of the other countries particularly, this is another common thing around the world, is that a lot of the immigrants that came to the United States, and there are studies that show that during the period of time from around 1630, 1640 to the mid 1700s, and sometimes later than that, there was that a high percentage, and percentages estimate as high as 75% of all of the men the young men between the ages of 18 to 30, maybe 35, came here either as enslaved people, as indentured servants, or as transported people. Now, if they were any one of those categories, and there's a very, very high percentage of them that appear magically in the record in America and have no roots. And the reason they have no roots is because these were primarily uneducated people who came here either because they were promised some kind of work, or came here because they were enslaved or arrested and convicted and shipped here. We often think of Australia as being a country that was settled by a lot of transported people, criminals. And if you know what's the history of the United States, you'll probably find that the number of people who came here either indentured or enslaved is probably just about as high as it was in Australia. The Australians celebrate that. The Americans deny that it exists. Okay, so let's kind of move along here. This is, by the way, the change file for this particular person. You notice that, and it's, you can't see all the detail, obviously, but you can see there are four sources there. And that's it. I mean, there's nothing what are you going to argue about here? Then there is this is the number. This isn't even the total list. This is just a part of the changed list, the work that's been done on this one individual. I mean, it's time to move on, folks. Once you get to this person and you've identified him, and all this work is being done, and it's not productive work at all. You can see what kinds of things here: relationship added, and it's recent. I mean, it's fairly recent now. Now, another rut, and this is not quite as obvious, and it's a little bit more. It's something that happens kind of quite a bit out there, and it's obvious from looking at the list of sources in Family Search. If you want to understand this one, this is BMD, which means birth, marriage, and death plus census. And that means that these are the four classes of records that people focus on. Here's the good news about it. They're generally available for people back to around 1850. The answer is they're not generally not available before 1850. And so when people keep looking for these records past the time when they were actually produced is when it becomes a problem. And it's not an easy answer to say when these occurred and when they didn't. It's easy with censuses because the census records start on a certain date and end on and proceed up to whatever date they end. So American censuses, U.S. Census begins in 1789 and ends in the present census. The most recent one available is 1940 or 1950, excuse me. But before 1850, they didn't have all the information from the family. They just had one person's name, the house, the homestead, the owner of the house or whatever. And so that's very limited utility. But here, if this is all you work on, then your work is going to be very well restricted to those years. In other words, that's all those years that you're ever going to get research. And it's very common. The question is that perhaps you're comfortable in your rut and you don't realize that there's Everest-sized genealogical challenges that are out there awaiting for your effort. This is your Everest-sized challenge. I and my family have been mountain climbers for a long time. And it was one look at this generated picture that was said, by the way, the guy's not wearing enough clothes to be that high on a mountain. So if that's a problem. But anyway, but there are challenges like this. And so what I'm trying to say is that it's time to kind of break out of your comfort zone, break out of the rut that you're in, and start looking at the mountains of challenges that are out there. And I firmly believe that genealogy challenges are just as difficult as many of the other physical things that are out there. If you don't think it's hard to sit in a library all day long and do research or work on a computer all day, then it is just it's a different kind of tiredness. It's not the great outdoor physical climbing, but it's draining to spend all those hours doing research and working. So what are some of these challenges? Let's kind of think about some of the things that we could adopt to give us an incentive to move out of the rut and start to acquire the skills and the information and the desire to look at other people on our family lines. One challenge is to prepare and go to an archive. And then you have to gain admission to the archive and do original research into historical documents. Now, Some archives are fairly simple, straightforward. Some of them require actual taking courses and being educated before they will allow you to come in and do research. And there's all different levels in between that. But having worked in archives over the years, I realized that part of the difficulty is gaining admission, and the other part of it is actually gaining access to the documents, because archives as by nature are closed, and that means that you can't go to the shelves and pull the records off. You have to request each document as you want to get to it. And having worked for a year in the Maryland State Archives, digitizing records for Family Search, I was even reinforced the information and the experience that I had. And then the experience that I had in getting readers access to the internet, to the National Archives of Washington, D.C., and the Library of Congress, both gave me additional insight, as well as working with university archives and university special collections and all sorts of things that over the years. One of the second challenge, and we're just talking about individual challenges here, is to learn a language spoken by your ancestors well enough to read documents in that language. Now, you really don't have to get to the speaking level. You don't have to be able to communicate. You don't have to be able to write anything or communicate anything. What you need to do is understand a very focused subset of the language that deals with genealogically valuable resources. If you're talking about parish registers, probably the total number of words you would need to know and understand would be around 200 or 300 words, plus being able to read the handwriting, of course, which is a different part of the problem, and also being able to decipher the names. But learning a language spoken by your ancestors well enough to read has been done by literally hundreds and hundreds of people who are doing research in genealogy, and it's well worth the effort. And in a sense, you become an expert at that point, because once you know how to read those records, you are able to help other people do their research in that language. That's something that my wife Anne has done for a long time with Swedish records. So this one's important. Prepare and travel to the country of origin of your ancestors and see the places they lived, and talk to your relatives who still live in the country. Many of my friends have done this, even recently, and many of them have long stories to tell about their contact with their relatives in their country of origin, and the advantage of this. In my particular circumstance, my ancestors, all of my family lines go back well into the early 1800s and to the 1700s. And yes, I do have relatives in a lot of these countries, because my DNA tests show me that I have relatives in different countries. But as yet, and because of my own research, I haven't really had anybody that I was, like my grandparents or my great grandparents or whatever, that I could, or relatives at that level, that I would be incentivized to go visit. So from that standpoint, it depends on your pedigrees, how much information you have as to whether this is even possible. But for some people, it's just the possibility of going to the country, even if you don't find the relatives, but of going to and seeing the places where they lived is of great interest. It's also interesting to go to those who are more recent relatives and travel to the places they lived. And here in the United States, we have over the years visited a lot of cemeteries, and it's helpful to get to know the cemeteries. Another way to do this is teach classes. Become proficient enough, have enough confidence in what you do know, even if it's a narrow subject. Maybe all you know about is doing research in Virginia or Kentucky or someplace. but that's enough to present at conferences and at classes and go about how to do research in that genealogical area. So if you'd never thought about it, I would, it's very strong. I encourage people who have learned and understood and became proficient in some area to spend some time teaching others. So there are many challenges out there if you want to keep learning and think about what they could be. And there are some things that definitely take you out of the rut of focusing year after year on the same names. So how do you avoid getting in a rut into a rut in the first place? Well, the first thing you do in northern Arizona is don't drive on the roads during rainstorms or after rainstorms. Most of the water in the desert up there runs off, and it tends to run off in dry washes that are dry when it's not raining and wet when it's raining. And a road like this could look just like this, and you could go right over there a little ways and run into a river of water running across the road, which you could not pass. So there are a lot of things like that. And how you do that is you understand that when you once it's I guess it's a question of I've done enough. And the answer is it's with you and your own ideas of how much is enough. And for me, for example, once I got back to William Tanner and I spent 10 or 15 years off and on looking for additional records that I figured I'd done enough, and that until there were more records that were becoming available, I wouldn't find any additional information. Well, and what's happened recently is we've had artificial intelligence that has done handwriting recognition and has done deeds and probate files. Well, these are the two ones that I've been going through record by record for years. And within a matter of just a few minutes, by using the familysearch.org/labs program and the full text search, I was able to find deeds for William Tanner showing his wife and one of his sons to confirm all this research that I've been doing forever, that the names of the people and how they're related. So, we have really their technology is probably getting to the point where some of these things that you've been banging your head against the wall on are going to be resolved. Now, the common theme of the difficult goals that I've kind of went through here is that you need to take the time to learn. Sometimes what happens, this is speaking personally, sometimes I get to the point that I stop and I go, oh, it is time for me to start learning. And then I get online and I start watching videos and I start looking at the information that I need to learn and may spend a great deal of time learning. If there was any benefits from being sequestered for a couple of years during the COVID was that I took time then to learn a lot of things that I had been waiting to learn about. There are times in our lives when we realize that any particular advance in what we're doing is going to require to be learned, more additional learning. And if we're wanting to, we see we have all these English relatives, or we see all these Dutch relatives, or we see all these Finnish relatives, and we say, well, someday I'm going to try to do that. Well, maybe someday is the day that you sit down and start to see what kind of resources there are to learn Finnish and what kind of an effort it would take to learn enough to do the genealogy. And the same thing would happen in any country where your ancestors spoke a language different than the one you speak. And by the way, that's every single language in every single country. Because no matter where your language, even if you say, oh, well, my ancestors spoke English because they lived in England. Well, they only spoke English for a period of time, because if you go back in any time period, in England, the language has changed, and we get back to things called Middle English and Old English, and they're not even vaguely like what we speak today. It seems as hard as they're as hard as any foreign language to learn. And we all had to start somewhere. So no matter what it is that you see, how much you think someone else has accomplished and how much more they know and they're an expert and all this, there's nothing that keeps you from taking them learning and focusing on an area where then you can become the expert. One of the problems is that you may know enough to work on your family tree, and you're kind of able to find people, and you're doing and you're feeling like you're doing the work. But then if you analyze it a little bit, you're failing to realize how much more there is to learn. And where you see that immediately is if you look at your pedigrees. And as I mentioned, and this is the trap. I have to mention this trap. This is one that really puts you into a rut, and that's the fan chart. When you look at a fan chart, all you're going to see is direct line ancestors back. And and although you're looking at a spread of direct line ancestors, the problem that you're focusing on is that you're not looking at any of their families. It's just the names of two people going back and back, or one person if there's only one person. And so the problem is you don't realize the fact that you may be completely ignoring the whole family. And fan charts don't really communicate very well. They're very nice and they're pretty, but they don't communicate well that there are families associated. And they also do not communicate well into relationships between families and where they lived and how they were together. For example, one of my family lines came from England. Three of the lines came from England and ended up in Australia. And then they intermarried. And so all three of these lines are in my family lines. But that part about them being in Australia and originating in England and all that is lost on a fan chart, in a sense. So I know that there's different ways on Family Search to look at the fan chart from different like who has what and all that kind of thing. But in the sense that it puts you focused more on what's missing than what you have, is what I would say. So you learn something when you actually need to learn. And you only need to learn when you get to the point where you need to make a decision about what you're going to do. And if you pick up and put, like, you go back to the same place you've always gone back, that's comfortable because you don't have to think about it. You know what you're going to go looking for. And you also know you're not going to find anything, and you know you're not going to ever get it done. But then if you just one day sit down and say, what else do I really need to think about? And what else would I like to be understanding? Is start learning about some of your more recent ancestors. Because the stories that you get from your ancestors and the stories of how they got here and where they came and what kind of information is available is fascinating. One of the benefits of my particular family relationships over the years, benefits as a genealogist, not as someone who has a big mess on their hands, is that when you get some contacts with your relatives, they may say, oh, you're doing research. I got some documents you'd love to see, or some photos or anything else. Most people just automatically assume that they don't know any of their relatives, and so therefore there's nothing they can learn from them. And the answer is, well, maybe when you reach out to and become more involved in the families than you are in individuals, then you might just find there are other people who have this information. And over the years, between Ann and I, have acquired quite a massive amount of information from all the relatives out there. And I'm not saying you're going to find it, but I get good stories about people who even find a few photographs and maybe a letter or two, which is more than they would have ever expected to find. Well, one way you can start to get a little bit more knowledge about what to do is to start with the Family History Guide. Now, the Family History Guide is the basis for teaching the missionaries lessons. They're actually the lessons on Family Search. They're on the Family Search Help Center. You have to dig down through it and go down and get the Learning Center. And when you get there, there'll be some research question. There'll be a whole set of lessons on Family Search. On the familysearch.org website that will teach you all how to do it. The same lessons that the missionaries use, who are being taught here at BYU, the BYU library, and up in Salt Lake at the Salt Lake Family Search Library, and in other places around the United States. So this is a great place. It's also the official training arm of the National Genealogical Society, NGS, and for all of their societies. And so this is a great tool. It's free, it's available, and it's the fhguide.com, and it's structured so that you can learn step by step all the different information. And what I say, which is, I definitely believe this. If you were to go through this whole training here, you would know more than probably 2/3 of the genealogists in the United States. Okay, so here's some skills that you might want to become acquainted with. These are things that help you go further with your research. And you may have not even tried to focus on it. You may think that I just am not going to read this stuff. And on the other hand, if you do spend some time on it, you'll begin to understand. This is becoming more and more important because younger people in our society are not spending any time learning how to do handwriting. Even the schools that teach handwriting teach one kind of handwriting and basically don't give the children any kind of exposure to other kinds of handwriting. And so reading handwriting has become a specialized skill and becoming more specialized as time passes. So that would be one area to start to learn. Another one would be understanding legal documents. These include deeds, wills, and probate files, which are tremendously valuable genealogical resources. Whole families can be found in wills and probate files, and sometimes even in deeds. And so getting this information is tremendously helpful. And a lot of people I talk to constantly, not say frequently, frequently, when I mention wills and probate, they say, well, I just can't understand that stuff. I don't know anything about it. Well, that tells me that's a learning opportunity. Like I said, with a foreign language, this isn't something where you need to be able to become a lawyer and go to court. This is just learning a subset of terms and language that you need to know the details on. And there's plenty of online helps to learn about the language in deeds and wills and probate files. And even from our BYU YouTube channel and on the BYU Library website, the BYU Library YouTube channel and the BYU Library website, there are probably a dozen different videos on wills and probate and a lot on deeds. So, as I mentioned previously, one of the area skills that opens up whole worlds of research is learning how to do research in a language not your own. Some of us benefited by taking languages in either grade school, high school, or at their university level. Some of us have lived in foreign countries and have learned the language by force, and of learning it in order to survive in the country you went to. So basically, there's ways to do that, but it doesn't have to be painful. And today, there's lots of online resources for teaching languages. And here's one that is something that most people wouldn't think about. And I think it's really important, and that is understanding and using migration patterns. Too many times, what I see is that people try to see what happened to someone. For example, one very common one that I hear about all the time is that you have my ancestors in Pennsylvania, and the next one shows up in Virginia, and the next one shows up in Kentucky. The answer is, hmm, well, there really isn't a migration pattern that supports that. So I would question that unless there's some very substantial documentation that supports the fact that your ancestor picked up from their German farm in Pennsylvania and traveled down to Virginia so they could cross the mountains and settle in Kentucky. There are some things like that. That's the purpose of migration patterns, and reading about the migration patterns and learning about the patterns of migration in all the countries, meaning where your people may have moved from or to during the time frames, is tremendously important in understanding where to look and how to look and whether or not you're following the right path. And then there's cluster research. And cluster research has been around for a long time. It's previously was referred to as jurisdictional research, and it's had some other acronym type names that go with it. But cluster research is basically expanding your research beyond the actual relatives into their friends, business relationships, educational relationships, anything that goes about the family, and taking that information. Once you do that, you're likely to find out a lot more about the person than you did previously. I use my great grandfather, Henry Martin Tanner, as an example a lot. And one of the examples that comes from Henry is that he wrote about a 2-page history of his life, and that was all the written documents we had from Henry Tanner. But his neighbor was a prolific writer and kept diaries, and those have been published. And now that information gives a lot of insight into the Tanner family. And if you want to start pretty simple, then you can get out and watch some genealogy videos. They're on the BYU Library Family History Center website, and they're free there, and they're free on YouTube. And we are at, right now, when I loaded this, it was 996 videos, but I know we've loaded a few since then, so we're probably around 1,000 videos. And that's a lot of information. So this is a real good place to get started. This is what I mentioned earlier, and this is the Learning Center on FamilySearch.org. And I'm coming back to it so that to reinforce that there is the specific class-oriented step-by-step lessons on here. And you see one that says Family Search, Family Trees Essentials, and one that says Research Essentials. And then there are these homeland pages, research pages. These have gone up recently, meaning within the last year or two, and they are amazing. They cover a huge number of countries, and they are like they're helpful in addition to the family history guide, because there's different information, and there's things to learn from both. And then there's lots of technology skills, and this is basically the basic kind of stuff that you need to know. Now, what we found out is that in teaching these lessons to the missionaries, as my wife and I do, we have found out that even people who have been doing research in genealogy for many years benefit from going through the lessons, because they reinforce skills that they may never have looked at. And that may be the ones that are a little bit outside of their rut. And MyHeritage is now building fairly substantial right now, and it's growing rapidly. Amount of information about genealogy education and resources in the MyHeritage knowledge base. They also have the MyHeritage Wiki, and they have other resources now that they are in the process of developing and increasing and improving. They intend to have some very substantial amount. If you need to take a genealogy course, there are 40 lessons here, 5 hours total of time, and it's for beginners. And it's a step-by-step way to learn how to do genealogy. Now, if you've been involved in genealogy for any period of time, then you're looking at RootsTech coming up again in the March next year, the 6th through the 8th of March, in the Salt Palace in Salt Lake City, Utah. And basically, all of the subjects that are taught, not all of them are recorded, but many of the videos are, and many of the lessons are submitted as videos. And if you go through the search, you'll see that there are now 4,435 videos in all different languages and in all different levels and all different subjects on the RootsTech website. And so this has turned into a tremendously valuable resource for a lot of information. It's just rootstech.org. And then you have to click around on the website to get to looking at the videos. Now, I mentioned learning handwriting. Well, there are formal lessons for that. There's tutorials out there. There's tutorials. Many of the tutorials come out of Europe, and there are language tutorials for teaching old handwriting. The British National Archives in Great Britain has script tutorials. It's called paleography, the learning how old language is written. And the older the language and the more difficult, usually the more different the language, the handwriting is going to be. And it may be more and more difficult. But here are the tutorials for between the 1500s and the 1800s on European scripts. And there's different languages. This is not the entire page of the language tutorials. If you're going to do Spanish, for example, there's Catalan, but there's also in Espanol, in English, in English. And then if you go down, there's another one in Spanish for Spanish. Spanish is the second most spoken language in the world, but it's also very diversely in the way it's spoken around the world. So there's a lot of difference sometimes between the countries, different countries in the way they speak Spanish. Attend a genealogy conference or workshop. Of course, I talked about RootsTech's resources, but also that's a great opportunity if you have that opportunity to attend in person. And it's time right now. Registration is open in 3 more days, and from the date of this presentation. And coming to RootsTech is a way to understand how diverse and how well received genealogy is. So if you've been doing genealogy by yourself and you don't think anybody else in the world does genealogy, come to RootsTech and you'll have your world expanded to where you can find people who really will sit there and listen if you start telling them about your ancestors. One thing I learned a long time ago, many years ago, is when I ask, how is your research going, to someone, I am prepared to sit there and listen until the person runs out, because that's what you have to do. And the other is NGS has its own conferences, and I understand that they're going to switch year from year to being online, and then they'll be in person. But I think they'll reconsider. I think once they get online, it's very difficult to go offline now. Roots Tech went online for COVID, and then found out that they had a tremendous audience out there that they had not even begun to open up into the millions of people watching Roots Tech instead of a few thousand. And so they now are going all year long in producing things for what's happening in Roots Tech, and it's all online. And then the in-person conference is just part of this. It'll continue to be the in-person conference, but there'll always be the online portion of it. And read a book. If you really need to have some details and understanding about any kind of research, there's always a book. There's another book on every subject. And these are some of the most recognized in each of three areas, and that is in American genealogy and in British or Great Britain or UK genealogy and in Scottish ancestry. These are the three kind of basic books for that. That Ancestral Trails book's about 600 pages long, so it's quite a hefty deal. And at the BYU Library Family History Center, we have a virtual help desk, and you can join live, and the hours are printed here on the website. This is the new website. We have two different websites. They both come to the same click in to get to the virtual desk. But this is the newer one and probably will replace the other one eventually in some time. But here, all you have to do is click during the hours and talk to us directly. So there's somebody on the desk. You might have to wave your arms and kind of whatever to get their attention, but sometimes, but it's helpful. And there's 130 of us, around 130 of us that are ready, willing, and able to talk to you and answer your questions. And when you go to the Family Search Library website, you'll see there's a thing that said Genealogy Help. You can either come in and get an appointment to work with somebody in person, or you can go online and request a consultation. They're usually 20-minute consultations. Our consultations on the virtual help desk are not timed. We don't have an exact time. It's up to the missionary and the person working and the patron that comes to determine how much they want to talk. So this is an alternative also. Clicking through on the Family Search take a trip. I already mentioned that possibility, but it doesn't have to be to a foreign country. It could be to someplace close at hand, just to refresh yourself with the relatives that you might have in that cemetery. Visit a library and ask about genealogy. This is the Boston, I got Boston here. No, New York Public Library. The New York Public Library has one of the largest genealogical resources in the United States, and it's a great resource. So here's a page from the genealogical research at the New York Public Library. So they have databases and census, passenger list, all different things. And visit an archive. This shot is the interior of the Maryland State Archives, where my wife and I, Ann and I, spent a year digitizing records for Family Search. It's a very lovely archive, and they're very helpful. And I can attest to the fact that there are records here that are not available any other place because they are not yet digitized. And we only scratched the surface of what was digitized here and what needs to be digitized. Visit a special collections library. Almost every major university, and even some of the lesser universities and colleges, may have a library with special collections. They may have things from the area where your ancestors lived or where you live, and you want to find out about somebody more close to you may have more information than you can imagine. And as your genealogical skills increase, you'll start to see these opportunities to discover more about your ancestral file. As you learn more, you have more appreciation for what you don't know. And so as that passes, you always see opportunities to learn more. Okay, well, thanks for watching.